thanks for the introduction, Al, and thanks so much for inviting me tonight. I really love talking about fire, so any opportunity I get to, even if it's just one person, I can go on for forever about fire. So since this is a little bit more of an informal talk than I'm used to doing, I just really want, if anyone at any point in the talk has any questions or even a comment, just jump right in. Don't worry about stopping me. It's much more fun that way, and I get to interact with you guys a little bit more. So yeah, if you see anything that I'm talking about and you have a question about it, just like I said, jump right in. So like I said, I'm going to talk about habitat recovery after fire tonight. And before I get started, I really want to, I don't want anyone to be under any illusions that I know anything about butterflies. So you're not going to hear too much about butterflies, and if I do talk about butterflies a little bit, I'll probably say something wrong about them. So like I said, if you want to jump in, especially if you have any information about butterflies and how it might fit into fire, those would be great comments, because we can integrate them a little bit more into the conversation. And so, like I also said, there we go. I've been doing fire for a long time, and it's something that's been really important to me in my professional life, and is just really interesting to me. And when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Vermont, I would spend my summers in Utah working for the Forest Service, and just sort of accidentally got put on these prescribed fire crews doing burns in different parts of Utah. And when I first started doing this, and someone was basically paying me to light things on fire, it was very much a head-scratching experience, because everything up until that point in my life really was telling me I should be going to jail for doing this. So there's definitely a little bit of a pyromaniac in me, and I got hooked on prescribed fire and learning more about fire as soon as I was an undergrad. And so I took that with me when I went to get my master's at Yale. I was still really interested in fire, and really wanted to make it part of my master's project. And so I got some funding to head up to Alaska and study wildfires up there, and was lucky enough to go during a pretty severe wildfire season up there. And the 2 summers I was up there, more acreage burned during those 2 summers than the previous 13 or 14 years combined. So it was a really good opportunity for me to study wildfires. When we look at sort of the impact of wildfires globally, they occur just about everywhere. There's really no place on this earth that's not impacted by wildfires, unless it's too cold. Hey, that's not the laser. Polar regions, or areas where there's no plants at all, deserts. But really, wherever there are plants growing, there are wildfires burning. And this map just shows the frequency of wildfires. And the blue areas are really sort of deceiving. It's weighted towards these areas in the Sahara and in Brazil, where there's a lot of agricultural burning, so it's picking up not necessarily wildfires. The blue is really where a lot of the wildfires are occurring. And so my main point in just showing this map is that really plants and wildfires, they go together. And fire as a type of disturbance and its impact on habitats, to me, it's really unique. When we think about types of disturbances like tornadoes or hurricanes or floods, earthquakes, volcanoes, fire is really one of the only ones that we get to control. We can't do a prescribed tornado or a prescribed earthquake, but we can do prescribed fires, and we can control much better than other disturbances how fires impact the landscape. They're also somewhat unique in the way that they interact with plants. The combustion process really creates a lot of conditions that favor certain types of plants and can disfavor other types of plants. When a fire burns through an area, it volatilizes a lot of the organic matter, and that can release a lot of nutrients, so it acts as a natural fertilizer. Also, by removing organic material, it exposes mineral soil, which is really a great seedbed for a lot of plants, so it creates good seedbed conditions. And the organic matter can also inhibit seeds from accessing moisture, so it can provide moisture for seeds. Fires can also be good because by clearing away a lot of vegetation, they bring a lot more sunlight into the understory, and that creates a lot of great growing conditions for plants. So fires are really in a way, they're like nature's farmer. They can clear land and make great growing conditions for plants. So before I get into sort of habitat recovery and wildfire, I want to talk a little bit about habitat and just sort of get a good definition going. And when we talk about habitat of any organism, really, sort of the overriding factors are climate. An organism needs a certain kind of climate to live in before it can really thrive. And we can really boil that down to precipitation and temperature. Of course, there's different ways of measuring that. And sort of basic habitat types across the world can be plotted against precipitation and temperature. And here in the Northwest, sort of Western Washington, our main forest types are the temperate rainforest, and then sort of in the range like around Seattle, just temperate forests. And they fall sort of in the middle in terms of temperature, and they in the middle to the extreme end of, as we have been finding out this past month, precipitation. And then on top of that, once you consider climate, there are some other important factors as well that can dictate what kinds of habitats are available. Disturbance, including fire, is definitely one of them. Topography is a big factor contributing to habitat, and soil is also a really important factor that contributes to habitat. So when you consider Western Washington and the climate that supports the temperate and the temperate rainforest here, we still have a pretty wide diversity of vegetation types. One of the most common, obviously, in the lowlands is our coniferous forests, which cover a lot of Western Washington. But even within the climate, we still have very different habitat types, like prairies. And I've recently gotten involved in doing work in prairie ecosystems and fires this summer, and it's a pretty fascinating ecosystem. And for anyone that likes butterflies, you also have a attachment to prairies in terms of the Taylor's checker spot butterfly. So habitat is controlled by all these factors, including fire, and within a habitat, some of the main characteristics that help define habitat for animals specifically are the plants. When you look at animal habitat requirements, including the Taylor's checker spot, really how the plants are structured and the different species that are there are really important elements of that animal's habitat. So once you've got the climate, it's really the plants that are there that are helping to define that animal's habitat. And so these are just some of the main characteristics of Taylor's checker spot. And if anyone sees anything else on there that I should add, let me know. But it really has to do with short-statured herbs, prairies of a certain size, specific host plants for a larvae to feed on, flowers for the adults for a nectar source, and then not so much to do with plants, but aquatic features. So now moving a little bit more into habitat recovery after fire and some of the factors that can affect that. There's really breaks down into three sort of groups of concepts. And the first one, fire severity. Has anyone heard that term before or know what it means?
Which?
Fire severity.
Oh, yeah.
Great. So can you tell me a little bit what you think the definition of fire severity is?
Well, it's on a scale, right? A non-severe fire is one that you light from around your feet and stamp out as a campfire. The severe fire is one that wipes out everything in and around wherever you are. That's the maximum severity, and then just all degrees in between, right?
Exactly. Great. So fire severity, its definition is the ecological impact of fire. So how fire is impacting the ecosystem characteristics. And generally, it's correlated with fire behavior. So a really small, mildly behaved fire has low severity, while a giant raging crown fire that is covering thousands of acres has a high severity. But that's not always the case. And then beyond, and what the scale of fire severity has real implications for habitat recovery. So what was there, as a fire becomes more severe, takes longer to come back. Also really important is plant adaptations and how they have adapted to fire over time. That can also affect recovery. And then another concept is departure from normal. So what kinds of fires are, oh, shoot.
So how do you establish normal fire regimes? Is it historical observations?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll get into that more. This is sort of just an introductory slide. But yeah, it has to do a lot with historical observations. And you can measure tree rings to determine historical fire regimes. You can look at lake sediments to figure out what historical fire regimes are. So there's a lot of different ways. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so doing cores in ponds, you can actually determine each year there's a new layer of silt that's laid down in ponds, especially if there's not a lot of turbulence or inflow and outflow of those ponds. And from that you can determine what plants are growing there and how much fire was occurring over thousands of years in time. Yeah?
What's the main factor in determining a regime? Is it just the frequency or severity also?
Those are the two big ones. Definitely. It's funny, scientists talk a lot about fire regimes and they're like, we need to consider more than just severity and frequency, and they talk about the season of occurrence and the size of the fire and the shapes of the fire and sort of how all those things are distributed through time. And really when a lot of people start talking about it, it really just does boil down to severity and frequency. Those are two easy points to convey and talk about. So yeah, so the fire regimes, how the fires affect the landscape, and then an individual fire, how that departs from the normal can really affect habitat recovery. And so this is a video from Alaska from my master's project. And I thought this was a really good way to sort of illustrate those three different concepts. And this was taken in 2004 in interior Alaska to the east of Fairbanks. And it is a purposefully set fire within an unburned island in a wildfire. And this is what we would call a high severity wildfire. As you can see, it is really burning. And as far as the habitat goes, within 1 minute, this boreal forest habitat has disappeared. This fire is pretty much. What's that? No. I wouldn't be here if I was there. Amazingly, you could take a camera like that and put it in a small cooler-sized box and just put it right in the middle of a wildfire, and it will not melt. And the only thing that the box just has, about this much air insulation, and you just take like a little ice pack cooler that you would put in like a small cooler, and that seems to do the trick.
So this is real time at first.
Yes. Yeah. So this is that's about a minute of video, and it's one of the interesting things about that is just how quickly a fire can move and how small it actually is when you consider it. If you were you often see photos of wildfires and they look like they just occupy these huge blobs of land, but if you were to fly over them, even the biggest wildfires, you would just see little ribbons of flame moving through the fire, or moving through the forest. So as far as fire severity goes, one of the main measures of fire severity is crown mortality. How many of the overstory trees were killed in the fire? This one clearly killed 100% of the trees in this forest, so it had high severity from that aspect. Another way to look at fire severity is the impacts on the soils. The structure, the biota in the soil, the little living organisms in there, and all of the roots in the soil really have a strong impact on how vegetation recovers after fire, so how quickly habitat will come back. And so from a soil heating perspective, this fire was actually not that severe. It moved very quickly, and it was sort of typical for this environment, and the soils are very deep and insulating.
Does the season of the year make much difference?
Absolutely, and I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Okay.
And from a plant adaptation perspective, this fire would be different in different ecosystems. Plants in Alaska are very specifically adapted to this kind of fire. So while it is severe from a crown mortality perspective, it's not for this actual ecosystem.
Is that a spruce forest?
It was, yep, black spruce forest. And you can see a couple of deciduous trees in there. Those were quaking aspen. And then finally, from a departure from normal perspective, this is a very typical fire for Alaska. If it were to occur at a different time in the season, it would be a departure from normal. So fire severity, I think the best way to define it is really is like cooking a turkey. The main functions of fire severity are the heat output of the fire, how intensely it's burning, and how long it's burning in one spot for. So if you take a little campfire and you put it out in the woods, it may not put off a lot of heat relative to that crown fire we just saw, but it will be a heck of a lot more severe in that one location than that crown fire would be, because just for hours it would just be pumping heat into that soil. And it would take a long time for plants to recover in that one spot. So time and temperature is really the main aspects of fire severity. And to define it a little more technically, in terms of plants, really the key temperature that determines death in plants is about 70 degrees Celsius or 158 degrees Fahrenheit. And at that temperature you have tissue death in plants. So if you have a shrub growing and its roots are below, 6 inches below soil, and the fire may be burning at 500 degrees Celsius or 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but below that soil it only needs to get to 70 degrees for that shrub to die. So this is a little graphic that shows about how long it takes for tissue to heat to that magic temperature, 70 degrees, where it dies. And this describes different shaped stems covered in about an inch of bark with about 500 degrees of ambient temperature. So sticking up a branch in the oven, this is about how long it would take for it to reach mortality, about 500 seconds. So if you think of a tree growing in a forest and having 500 degree fire around it, 600 seconds is quite a long time. That's several minutes. That if that tree has bark that's an inch thick, it will survive that fire. Of course, as the bark gets thinner, the tree will die sooner. Or also, if you think of roots underground, soil's an excellent insulator. If you're ever running from a wildfire, and you could somehow dig even 6 inches underground, you would probably be fine. Of course, it's hard to bury yourself if you're running from a wildfire. And sort of looking at the two places I've really spent a lot of time studying in graduate school are Alaska and Florida, and they really make great comparisons in fire severity. So in the boreal forest of Alaska, typically fires are crown fires, and they would be classified as high severity fires, as you can see in this picture. This was taken not far from where the video was taken. In Florida, in contrast, typically fires there are totally different in how they look. They just are very small fires, flame lengths that are maybe 3 to 4 feet tall, and they just slowly move through the understory. And so there, in terms of severity, those fires are much lower, and the time it takes for habitat to recover in these areas varies by a lot. So this is sort of the same area about a couple months after the fires in both locations. And in Alaska, you still have some smoldering stumps. There's really not that much sign of life. All of the spruce trees are dead. Whereas in Florida, none of the overstory trees, in this case longleaf pine, have died. And within weeks, you start to see plants coming back. So as far as habitat recovery goes, in Alaska you're talking decades, in Florida you're talking years. And this is another way to illustrate it. This is what is called a chronosequence series of photos in Alaska that shows different age stands over time, from 2 years after fire to 104 years after fire. And this is sort of typical forest succession. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you measure these fires in terms of time to climax for us, or do you define climax at all?
Climax is sort of, it's losing clout as an ecological term. So does anyone else know what he means by climax forest?
Oh,
We've got a Randy group here.
Yeah. So climax forest is a more traditional term that was really used a lot in the 1920s and 30s. There was an ecologist that really believed in his heart of hearts that every single ecosystem was at its optimum when it had no disturbance whatsoever. And that climax was when that ecosystem reached that point where it had no traits of having any disturbance before. And it was he truly believed that every ecosystem in the world had that potential to get there. And that's really where everything should be at. In reality, disturbance is really a big part of almost every ecosystem. And so when we talk about climax forest in Alaska, for instance, we start to see what could be called a climax structure at about 100 years. And what he meant by climax structure and what it still means is that if that forest is sort of allowed to move through time, it reaches sort of a stable point. And so the stable point for black spruce boreal forest is trees sort of slowing in their growth, not much change in the composition of the understory shrubs. And so if this was a climax forest 2 years ago, it would take about 80 to 100 years to get there. In Florida, by contrast, where fire is pretty frequent in the ecosystem, and this over here could be considered a climax forest in that it has old trees and that the understory really doesn't change that much over time. Recovery after fire only takes about 2 years. So this is a series of plots in Florida. You can see this is when they were burned. 1 year later, it already looks pretty much like before it burned. There's a little bit lower loading of shrubs.
Your view is with that marker is the same one over this 2 year span time?
Yeah, I didn't hold the camera level, so that's why you've got the different
Well, it's important
viewpoints.
because in your pre-fire example, you have a plant right at the base of that marker, which is a butterfly food plant.
Oh yeah.
It looks like it's toast after the fire, but 1 year later, there it is again.
Yep, and it's, you know, you can almost, it looks, 1 year later, it's the same size, if not even bigger than it was before. And then it sort of cut out after 2 years. But yeah, so in these plots, we measured the weight of each species. And by 2 years, it was the same weight as before the fire.
There's a huge difference in structure between the black spruce and the pine savanna, where you got ladder fuels and...
Absolutely, yeah. And so that plays a big role in terms of how fire behaves in those landscapes. But as far as habitat recovery goes, generally with low severity fires, pretty simple stuff, you would expect it to be much faster than with a high severity fire. Now, as far as fire severity goes, there's a couple of things that can control fire severity, and they're grouped into two different families of factors. One is called top-down controls, and one is called bottom-up. And if you think of, I think cars on a highway is a good way to think about that. A speed limit is a top-down control. It doesn't matter how fast your car is, you're still going to get a ticket if you go above the speed limit, and you're not allowed to do it. Whereas bottom-up controls would really be how fast your car is. So as far as fire severity goes, and top-down controls, climate is a top-down control in that when certain climate conditions happen, such as a drought, it doesn't matter what the bottom-up controls are. The climate will create high-severity fires across a lot of the bottom-up control factors. So, for instance, topography. When climate is marginal for burning, like it's sort of warm and dry, different aspects and different elevations will have different fire severity within the same fire. If there's an extreme drought going on, then fire severity will tend to be high across all of those terrain features. Another one is fuels. And if you have different types of fuels, they can encourage either higher or lower severity. But as climate changes, it can make severity consistent across all those fuels. And one of the places where it's really easy to see climate signals is the boreal forest in Alaska and Canada. And that's typically, I don't know if anyone's ever spent a summer in Alaska, but it's not very long. It's usually about 2 or 3 weeks. So in general, in Alaska, there is sort of a low amount of area burned because there's only about 2 or 3 weeks when it's hot and dry enough for things to burn. But if you look at this graph, you can see these really high spikes where the land area burned in the summer is 3, 4, 5, 6 times higher than sort of this lower average here. And that's really tightly correlated with blocking high pressure systems, which like we usually get in the summer here in Seattle. In Alaska, they're typically very small and short-lived, but sometimes they can exist all throughout the summer. And this is sort of to get back to your question about time of year when things burn in Alaska and severity. If you have a blocking high pressure system in Alaska that lasts for 2 months, then you have 2 months of burning conditions. And these fires that normally start in June and go out in early July are now burning all the way into August. And they have hotter and warmer and drier conditions to burn in, so they burn faster and hotter. At the same time, the moss layer, which is typically about a foot deep, usually only dries out a couple inches in a typical summer. If it stays hot and dry until August, it'll dry out a foot deep. And so these fires that are going bigger are also burning deeper down into that moss or duff material. And that's where a lot of the roots of shrubs and trees are located. So not only is the fire now killing shrubs and trees from above, it's also killing the root structure, which can really increase the fire severity in boreal forests and really can increase the amount of time that habitats that take to recover in Alaska. So in Florida, fuels are a stronger signal in fire severity. There aren't quite as many wild swings in climate like there are in Alaska. And part of that has to do with the fact that Florida pretty much burns any time of year. There's always lightning storms. It's always fairly warm and dry down there, even in the winter. So their fires are happening pretty much throughout the year. And fuels really can play a big role in fire severity. This is a picture in a wildlife refuge called St. Mark's in the Panhandle of Florida. The area to the right has been unburned for 20 years, and the area to the left is burned every 2 years. It's a demonstration plot they show so the public can see the impact of prescribed burning on the forest understory. If you were to light this area of forest on fire, the area to the left would experience a very low severity fire, while the area on the right would experience a very high severity fire. And in this instance, severity would correlate with overstory mortality. You would have almost no overstory mortality to the left, while on the right, just the intense heat and flames coming off of those shrubs would loft enough heat into the crowns to kill a lot of the buds and needles of those pine trees. Additionally, the buildup of pine needles on the forest floor would heat up so much that it would start to kill the roots of the pine trees. So you'd have quite a bit of overstory mortality and high fire severity in that stand.
A question on that. Ideally, the left is easier to manage, but is there a tradition or just lightning fires when we are putting them out so well, or Native Americans burning these as they do in parts of our world, or what?
That's a really good question. I think as in many places, there's a real debate about just how this ecosystem got its start from and how evolved, who really played a role in terms of how evolved this ecosystem is to fire. Native Americans certainly burned a ton in Florida, and they really used it as a management tool. But on the other hand, Florida receives more lightning strikes per mile than any other place in the US. So there's a really strong component of natural ignitions as well. And clearly for the past 8,000 years, Native Americans were playing a large role in burning these forests, but it's really unclear as to who had more of a hand in it, nature or people. And as far as a more recent history, this forest is it's very much like the prairies in Western Washington. It is a tiny fragment of what it used to be. And so what's left is pretty well managed with prescribed fire, but there's not much left. Do you have a question?
Do they take a pre and post plant inventory?
Not in a management setting. I will do it for researchers do it when we're trying to answer a question. But as far as land managers go, there are monitoring plots, but it's not like with every single burn they would do a pre and post inventory. Yeah.
My question kind of ties in with hers and maybe gets ahead. Since you have this comparison, every 2 years compared to a place that hasn't been burned for 20 years, we can look at, the increasing biodiversity after a burn. It reaches an optimum value, which may be somewhere between 2 years and 20 years.
Yeah.
Do they make decisions based on that? Because you won't have an unending increase in biodiversity, right?
Exactly, yeah. There's been a lot of studies that look at that from the plant perspective. I don't know, and some that look at it from total perspective too, of insects and animals and plants as well. And it seems like the magic number is 2-3 year fire interval down there. That's where if those forests receive fire every 2 to 3 years, that's where you hit maximum biodiversity. And interestingly enough, there's been very recently some folks that have found some really old pine trees in this area of the country, which was tough because it was pretty much logged 2 or 3 times over the past 150 years. And going back 200-300 years, the fire return interval, or how many times one area would burn, was about 2 or 3 years. So interesting that the maximum biodiversity really lines up with probably what the historical fire regime was. And land managers, they do pay attention to that, absolutely. And another thing they pay attention to is endangered species. Down here, the big one that's managed for in these forests is the red cockaded woodpecker. And the red cockaded woodpecker really likes these open forests with a lot of grass in the understory. They're sort of skittish. They have a lot of predators that will try and climb the trees and get to their nests. So they really prefer these open forests. So they burn a lot for the woodpeckers, and they burn a lot to maximize biodiversity.
A number of grasshopper species associated with these pine forests as well.
Are they really?
Yeah, endemic Florida.
Oh, cool. Yeah, and yeah, these as fire is excluded, the absolute number of plants sort of stays the same. It's just how they're spread out. A lot of them become very rare, and eventually they wouldn't persist anymore. So another control on severity. We've gone over climate and fuels. Topography is the other one. And I'm not going to get into all of them because there are so many different controls, but elevation is a pretty big one. And that's important around in the Mountain West, where we have a lot of elevation to deal with. And generally, when you plot out fire severity over elevation, you have the lowest severity at the middle elevation. So you think ponderosa pine forest. They tend to have the lowest severity fires. As you pull away in either direction, fire severity tends to increase, especially as you go up in elevation to sort of the subalpine forests. A lot of the, if you think lodgepole pine or subalpine fir, when they burn, they tend to burn at much higher severities. As you go lower, if you think of sagebrush or pinyon juniper forests, they tend to burn at higher severity fires. And then ultimately, severity just stops because it either becomes so hot and dry that there are no plants, or so cold and wet that it's just rock and ice. And then you can sort of map severity against some of these other factors. So the main control over fire severity at elevation is really the moisture. At the very low end, there's not enough moisture to grow plants, so there's nothing to burn. At the higher end, there's so much moisture and cold temperatures that it's too wet for anything to burn. And so there's another trade-off as well between the fire frequency and the fire severity. As you tend to have more frequent fire severity tends to be lower. And if you ever go hiking around Leavenworth, as I'm sure most of you have, and you go into the dry forest and then hike up to the subalpine forest, you can really see firsthand the differences in fire severity. So this is right outside of Isaac Creek Road, which burned in 1994, and this is just off the trailhead. This is a Doug fir ponderosa pine dry forest, and most of the trees are alive. They survived that fire. You can see the char on the bark, and there's a really healthy understory of plants. When you go up higher, granted it is still winter-like up here, so there's not as much green, but these were once lodgepole pines, and they were all killed by the fire. And in the understory, the plants that are growing there are not characteristic of what was growing there before the fire. This is a very much higher severity fire at this elevation. And while this area has already fully recovered, this area will take decades to fully recover. And so then another real impact on how habitats recover after fire is how plants are adapted. So there's really 5 general classes of plants and their adaptations to fire. And they're referred to as the avoiders, the invaders, the evaders, the endurers, and the resistors. And the avoiders, they really shudder at the sight of fire. These are the groups of plants that really have no adaptations to fire. You tend to find them in environments, this is the Boulder River watershed near Darrington, where there's really not that much fire. And western hemlock is an excellent example of an avoider. It doesn't have any resistance to fire as an individual. It doesn't have any way of taking advantage of fire in terms of its reproduction. It really, if it burns, it is removed from the landscape, and it takes a long time for it to come back. And I should also say that these mosses that grow on western hemlock, or that grow in rainforests, also take a long time to come back. Invaders are sort of the other end of the spectrum. They love to take advantage of really high severity fires. And this is a picture of fireweed in Alaska. And this area burned in August, so a very late season burn in Alaska. And it removed a lot of the organic matter and killed a lot of the plants that could have resprouted. And fireweed just absolutely took advantage of the situation. As you can see, it is more or less a monoculture in this area. So invaders some of their characteristics are they produce just a ton of seed, and that seed is very light and distributed widely. So fireweed, when these plants go to seed, they have seeds sort of like dandelions. So they just produce seed by the millions, and it's just distributed all across the landscape. So anytime an area burns, there's basically fireweed seed just coming in abundance to take over. Another thing about invaders is they grow very quickly and they reach maturity very quickly. So they are very rapidly able to dominate and colonize a site. But to their detriment, they are not that long-lived. They don't regenerate well in their own shade. And so while they're typically really good at colonizing a site quickly, they don't persist for that long. Another example of invader that's not such a good one is cheatgrass. So cheatgrass is very good at invading burned areas in sagebrush. And cheatgrass is a very invasive plant, so it has a lot of negative effects on ecosystems. Fireweed is native in Alaska, and it's part of the succession process after fire.
Does the fireweed serve a function of providing some kind of an organic mat once it's kind of past its time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Then kind of come through.
Invaders, one of the best things that they do is they anchor the soil, and they create cooler conditions in the soil, and they add organic matter to the soil. Others, like lupins and alder, have ability to take nitrogen out of the air and add it to the soil, so they act as fertilizers. So invaders can often do a lot to help prep the area for other plants when there has been a high severity fire.
What would tend to follow the fireweed?
In Alaska, you would have a lot of fast-growing shrubs like willow and alder. And then following that, you would either start to see spruce coming back in, or you could have a type shift to an aspen forest, depending on who gets there first, really.
Do you get berry in Alaska also as a arctostaphylos?
Yeah, no, it does not grow that far north. But there are a lot of shrubs in that same Ericaceae family. But I've never seen, I don't think bearberry grows that far north.
Well, it's in the Yukon, I know that.
Yeah.
But it might not make it to Alaska.
No, I think I've been through the Yukon, and there's much more lodgepole pine forest,
Right.
much drier forests. Alaska there's a lot more permafrost. So while it's actually quite dry, the atmosphere, you just dig down a foot and there's ice, and so there's a really good moisture source. And Kinnickinnic doesn't like it. Usually find it in drier areas. Evaders, they're a little more adapted to fire. As an individual, they're not very good at surviving fire, but they have really invested a lot of effort into creating progeny that is well adapted to fire. This is pitch pine, and it has serotinous cones. So the cones store their seeds indefinitely until they are exposed to heat, and then the heat actually opens the cone scales and releases the seed. So that's called an aerial seed bank. Other trees that do that are lodgepole pine. Black spruce in Alaska does that. Jack pine on the East Coast does that as well. And so these types of plants that are evaders are generally adapted to a more high severity fire regime, and that they are sort of willing to sacrifice themselves to a high severity fire in order for their seedlings to survive. And the seedlings themselves are really adept at growing in post-fire conditions after a high severity fire. So really sunny conditions with lots of exposed mineral soil. The endurers are a different class, and this is Pacific madrone. This is a good example of an endurer. Probably most plants are endurers, definitely most flowering plants. Endurers are just plants that are able to survive as rootstock during a fire and relatively rapidly resprout afterwards. So when you think of most shrubs, if an area is burned, if it's a fairly low or mid-severity fire, even that crown fire we saw the video of, typically the roots will survive even a fire like that and will really rapidly start growing after a fire. So endurers you find across a lot of different fire regimes, but they do especially well in low severity fire regimes. If you think about the longleaf pine stands in Florida, that entire understory is made up of endurers. All of those plants sprout really rapidly after fire. And then finally, there is the resistors. So these are plants that as individuals are able to survive fire. And some of the adaptations that they've been able to evolve to do that are really thick bark like ponderosa pine, and they elevate their foliage far above the surface. So they create a gap between surface fuels that typically conduct fire and their foliage. And so that keeps the foliage from catching on fire and also reduces the heat exposure to the foliage. So resistors you typically find growing in low severity fire regimes. And then to talk about fire regimes just a little bit, I've sort of talked about it, but across the US, they're really, when you look at patterns of fire, these types of plants sort of group themselves off into how fires pattern across the landscape. And this is a map created by Landfire, which is sort of a private-public partnership. And they were able to map all the different fire regimes across the US. And the ones in red, which you see mainly in the southeast and sort of along the Great Plains, and then in Florida and Oregon, or not Florida, California and Oregon. These are low severity, high frequency fire regimes. So the longleaf pine forests are a really great example of that. These are sort of oak savannas along the margins of the Great Plains. The orange, the fire regime group 2, those are high frequency, high severity fire regimes, and they define high severity as canopy mortality. And so this is a little bit misleading. You look at this map and you see there's a huge patch of area in the Midwest where there's fire all the time and it's high severity fires. Well, they call canopy mortality in the Great Plains the grass is burning off. So this is an area that's adapted to grass fires. And then fire regime group 3, these are areas that are sort of what we call mixed severity fire regimes. We have a lot of those out here. If you're ever in the East Cascades, that's a mixed severity fire regime, where you have a sort of a range of fire return intervals depending on what elevation you're at or what aspect you're at. And fires tend to be low to mid severity, sometimes they can be high severity. And if you look at that a lot in the Mountain West, you can see a lot of them fall sort of in mid-slope areas. I think that's the Blue Mountains there, where you have a lot of middle elevations. And then in sort of the Oregon-Nevada border, there's a lot of middle elevations, and this is sort of the east side of the Cascades. As you go further east, I was talking about pitch pine. Pitch pine is really common in Massachusetts into Connecticut. So this is sort of a mixed severity fire regime, or at least it was. And then further down south, you have the Mississippi Valley. I'm not quite sure actually why that would be mixed severity fire regime. And then fire regime group 4 is really predominant in the northern Rockies, and that is a low frequency, high severity fire regime. So if you think of the Yellowstone fires in 1988, those huge fires that were coming through, these areas are very much adapted to that kind of fire, and historically that's what happened there. And then finally, the 5th group is pretty much areas that don't have much fire. So you have the desert southwest, where there's really not enough vegetation to burn. You have the temperate rainforest in the northwest, and then you have what's called the asbestos forests of the northeast, which are just really too wet to burn at any time of the year. And then taking the whole fire regime concept to another level, this map shows, I failed to mention, this is pre-settlement what fires look like in the US. Obviously things have changed a lot since pre-settlement times. This is how much departure there is from pre-settlement fire regimes. The green areas are areas with relatively low departure. So the desert southwest, obviously, because it never burned in the first place. And a lot of these are fire regime group 4, sort of like lodgepole pine high elevation forests where there tends to be fire frequencies of about 100 years. But most of the US has had either moderate or high departure from fire regimes. And that is due to two things. One is land use and development. Grazing has changed a lot of vegetation structure so that things don't burn as easily in the Mountain West. And the other is fire suppression, which has had a major impact on how frequent fires are in the US. I also wanted to tie this into habitat. As fire regimes depart more from their historical norms, the types of fires that can come in can have a lot of implications for habitat recovery, a lot of negative implications. They can cause habitat recovery to take longer, or they can even cause vegetation types to change entirely. So you end up losing habitat. Yeah?
It looks like there was a lot of change in Washington.
In terms of this map?
Colors, aren't the colored, we had a lot of area that didn't burn, particularly kind of blue.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Natural, and now that's kind of changed, is that true?
So, yeah, if you look in this corner right here,
Yeah.
sort of western Washington.
Western Washington.
Correct, yeah. So this is a fire regime that land fire categorizes. Typically there's a fire once every 200 years. And then when you go over here, yeah, so it's moderate departure. That's interesting. I'm not sure why that. It should be, I would imagine it would be more of a green, since there's not that much fire to begin with in most western Washington.
Does it not mandate fires, slash fires and everything?
No.
You had a lot of slash burning that probably triggered other fires.
Yeah. I think what happened when they created this map is there was a lot of automation that went into it. So while it does show large trends nationally, it's what's called false precision. The more you zero in on one area, the less accurate it becomes.
Maybe I interpreted it wrong, but I thought this map was talking about the degree of departure from.
Correct.
Yeah, okay, well, so the lowland western Washington has largely been turned into semi-urban and.
That's correct, yeah.
Right, so that's why the change there.
I was just noting that it was, and that's, yeah, you can see these areas of red, and that's probably what's going on there, but as far as a region goes, it shows it as being moderately to highly departed, where most of the region is coniferous forest that doesn't really burn that frequently anyway. So I would think, to me, I feel like there should be more green up there. But again, with this map, once you start focusing in closer and closer, you start to lose accuracy.
Does that yellow potentially show the fire suppression that
Yes.
has gone on, the Forest Service and other people suppressing natural fire cycles?
Exactly. So yeah, the gray area is area that has mostly been developed for agriculture. Everything west of the Mississippi, where you see yellows and reds, that's a result of fire suppression and grazing. To the east of the Mississippi, that is more a result of fire suppression and development. And fire suppression to the west and east of the Mississippi are very different animals. So the east of the Mississippi, it's a lot, there's just so many people and there are so many fire departments that if a wildfire ever starts, it's never going to get bigger than a couple acres. Whereas out west, we still have a lot of trouble controlling wildfires and they can get quite big. And there's a lot of open land. So I also wanted to try and tie this into managing habitat a little bit in terms of how fires affect recovery and how managers have to look at it. And when you think of a habitat in its most simple form, you can pick a couple of important axes that define a habitat and sort of plot where an individual species likes to live. But maybe that's just part of their habitat, like nesting habitat, for instance. And so then you think about other requirements for the species, like where it goes to escape predators. Maybe that falls on differently in that space than nesting. And species often need to eat, so you need to think about where they need to forage. And that may be an entirely different habitat from where they're nesting. So as far as species management goes and habitat recovery after a fire, and this is a very simplistic sort of look at it too, managers really have their handful in terms of identifying what habitats are important and then managing them so that all of those habitat types exist in enough area and are present in a landscape close enough to each other that individual species can take advantage of them and have a sustainable population. I think one of my favorite examples of this is the northern bobwhite quail, which is a really important game species in the southeastern U.S. There's a really long hunting tradition for bobwhite quail, and people love them. And there's been a lot of work into defining their habitat. And just like with a butterfly, a lot of it falls into how the vegetation is structured in the landscape. And for them, winter food is really important, and cover is really important, and certain types of structure and composition of plants is important for their nesting. And all of those types of habitat are different and some of them require burning very frequently. Some of them, like winter food, actually, they do best if there's agriculture around. So, there's really not room for burning there. And then nesting requires a certain amount of burning. So as a land manager and implementing fire in an area, managing for the bobwhite quail, you have to have some areas that have frequent burning and other areas that have less frequent burning. All of that has to occur in equal enough proportion to provide habitat for northern bobwhite. And that's true for a lot of animals that live in fire-adapted ecosystems. And so that makes it's really a challenge for managers to make sure that mosaic of vegetation types exists on the landscape. Another important thing to think about is scale. When you think about sand that burns in a wildfire, it's going to, if we go back to boreal forest again, how it succeeds, there'll be several different types of vegetation stages from mosses and lichen immediately after the fire to a fully developed boreal forest. And so each of those provide habitat for different animals, and so it's important that all of those exist on a landscape at any one time. And so that's my awful cut of Kirkland's warbler, which is an endangered species in Michigan that depends on boreal forest. So it, in particular, just like sort of middle-aged jack pine forests, so forests that are 4 to 20 years old, anything else that won't really take advantage of. And because of that, and because fire was removed from the landscape in Michigan, along with many other places, this bird almost went extinct 50 years ago. It came really close to being extinct. And so, as a manager managing a really rare species, and looking at your entire management context, it's really important to make sure that at any given moment in time you have those middle-aged jack pine forests on the landscape, and you have forests that are coming into that middle age, and you have forests that are going out of it so that you can then burn it. So even when you're talking about just one species that you're managing on maybe a relatively small area, it starts to get pretty complicated quickly in terms of putting fire on the landscape. Another way to look at scale, if you have a larger landscape, is how those vegetation types tend to be distributed across the landscape. And so with boreal forests, you tend to have what's called a negative exponential distribution, where most of the land area is actually these really early successional stages, and really very, very small percentage of the areas get into being older forests, or what might be considered old-growth forests. So as far as managing fire across the landscape, that also presents challenges, and that you can't just have, if you're really trying to represent the natural habitat of mosaics across the landscape, you're really challenged with creating different areas of each one and putting fire on the landscape to do that. And previous graphic with the Kirkland's warbler. And then sort of really quickly some other management challenges or considerations that are often think about as small populations like the Taylor's checker spot. You can't do typical management that maybe you would do if you had all of the prairies in western Washington that used to exist here. It also becomes much more challenging because even one large disturbance or one large outbreak of disease could be a disaster for those butterflies. So you really have to take a much more hands-on. In terms of doing fires, you have to really make sure, since the fires are negatively impacting at least at first that meadow habitat, you really have to make sure that your fires aren't driving the population of butterflies you're trying to manage for off a cliff. Another really important consideration is invasive species and how they can take advantage of fires and maybe cause habitat recovery to occur slowly or degrade the habitat, which is especially challenging if you have a fire-adapted ecosystem. And then finally, other disturbances, windstorms, floods also interact with fires and plants, and environmental stressors as well, like climate change and insect pests. So I think that's about it. And if you guys have any more questions, I'm really happy to answer them.
I've been stifling myself. You're going to be interested in this. You probably would have told us if you thought of it, but most butterflies, well, many, if not most, butterflies in Washington are the product of interglacial fluctuations that have taken place over millions of years. So we can say fairly authoritatively they are adventitious creatures that have taken advantage of environments that have been in flux and are pre-adapted to, say for instance, a post-fire or a post-volcano. We have demonstrated how quickly, Mount St. Helens was recolonized. But there's another aspect too that pertains to, more immediate concern. For instance, there's a butterfly called the California tortoiseshell, Nymphalis california, and it uses as a food plant Ceanothus velutinus, a common fire, a bush that's enhanced by fires, forest fires. So it has a number of other butterflies. In fact, that's a guild plant for a number of butterfly species as a food plant. There's as many as, I think, 7 butterfly species that use it. So so there's this really synergistic thing going on. Butterflies that are pre-adapted to post-catastrophic events, including fires, and then the fact that an awful lot of these butterflies are in fact so well evolved in that direction that they depend on this kind of flux. But it is still living for all the reasons you just mentioned in the last spring, because in small population size, by the time we have come to recognize that any particular organism is threatened, it already is de facto a small population. So does anyone talk about the pre-adaptations to these flexible environments in your school?
Not well. I'm trying to think. Not that I can recall really. I'm sure maybe it's come up in different ways. But yeah, no.
Well, it dies right there then.
Yeah.
I got a question on prescribed fire and the risks associated with it. They're down in the South Sound prairies now. Looks like that's a piece of cake. They're not going to get out of hand. But something like that Alaska fire, seems to me that could really get over the fence and do a lot of damage.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So as your fire regime becomes higher severity or exhibits greater fire behavior, there's 2 things going on. There's the fire behavior associated with your fire regime and your population. So it's actually quite easy to do prescribed fires in Alaska because almost no one lives there, at least where the interior forests are. So they can go out with a helicopter and light 20,000.
Burning versus places where they go in and cut brush in order to, there may be areas like you talked about in California where they cut the brush because they can't go in and burn because of the houses and such. What sort of habitat?
That's a favorite topic of study. There are a ton of studies, and I think one of the best examples of that kind of study is there's a program that's over now. It was called the Fire Surrogate Program. So it was looking at they would set up different treatments. One would be prescribed fire, and others would be treatments like brush cutting that would mimic fire to reduce fuel hazard. And generally, as far as I think across the board, there was some big meta-analyses of all of the studies going on. They put these all across the country. The brush cutting really didn't do a lot in terms of increasing biological diversity relative to the prescribed fire. So brush cutting can do quite a bit to remove fuel hazards by thinning trees and decreasing the density of canopy fuels and taking all those fine fuels and putting them on the ground where they start to decompose. But there's no release of nutrients like there are with prescribed fires, and there's no elimination of the organic material. In fact, it's added to. And so it makes it really difficult for a lot of the sort of short-statured shrubs and forbs and grasses to maintain the toehold that they had under a prescribed fire regime or a natural fire regime. Chaparral is a little bit different because it's more of a high-severity fire regime, so but I would imagine brush cutting there would be sort of similar effects.
is we've been talking about habitat as the thing we're interested in, but in fact, is it as much for a fire manager to kind of protect homes and things like, you know, we're all a bunch of environmentalists, but people who live in areas with houses, they think, oh, fire management, great. This is how we keep from having our house burned down. So how do fire managers come in different types? Like, you're going to be the habitat type manager and somebody else is the protect the dwellings kind of fire manager?
Absolutely.
Or you would have to do both? I don't know. It seems like too tall in order.
Yeah, it is too tall in order. It doesn't usually happen that way, and it varies regionally. So areas where I worked in Florida, Apalachicola National Forest, Eglin Air Force Base, and St. Mark's, all sort of right in the heart of longleaf pine savanna country, are very focused on habitat and managing for biological diversity and endangered species. The effect of reducing fuel hazards is important to them, but really their guiding management philosophy is for ecological outcomes. And the reduced fuel hazard is sort of a side benefit. In the West, I think you see it flipped a little bit more. I think there's more of a focus on, like the other question, like more reducing fuel hazard and less on the ecological outcomes. So there's a lot of brush cutting. There's a lot of what's called pile and burn, which doesn't replicate the historic fire regime at all, really. And then as far as sort of the hierarchy goes, there are a national forest, for instance, will have a fire ecologist or an ecologist that is just focused on managing for ecological outcomes. And so they're in their box. And then they're they're fire management officers. And they are focused on managing fire. But they may not be focused on the ecological outcomes. They may be focused on reducing fire hazard. And oftentimes during the summer, they're just in firefighting mode. And so they're not managing proactively for a lot of the year. And yeah, I think those attitudes vary a lot by region for sure.
I've lived my whole life here, which is what, up to 45 years now. It seems to me that the fires have become much more frequent, much larger, and generally more severe. Does the data support that, or is just my Alzheimer's kicking in?
You're right on. Yeah.
It's Alzheimer's, okay.
There's more fires. So it's interesting, actually, if you look over time. So well before you were born, there was a lot of fires. They were not that severe. And then as the land was settled and fire suppression took into effect, there was a really strong decrease in the amount of fires, and with that, less severe fires. And fire suppression has allowed a lot of fuels to build up to the point where when fires ignite on the landscape, they sort of exceed the abilities of fire suppression efforts now. Even though we're spending record amounts on fire suppression, we're still seeing large increases in acreage. And so if you look at fires probably over the past 200 years, there's probably this dip, and now it's starting to go back up again. And as they go up, because there are so more fuels, just like that picture I showed of longleaf pine, those fires are more severe. And then you throw climate change on top of that, where the fuels are drying out more quickly for longer periods of time. That's also adding to the increased severity of fires. And there's data to support that for sure. Yeah.
Is there any evidence that we're actually in the process of converting timberland to savanna?
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's as convincing as the evidence to show that there's more wildfires and more severe wildfires, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and especially in the ponderosa pine forests of the Southwest, where they're experiencing really large, high-severity wildfires that are outside of the historical norm. And the trees aren't regenerating because they're not adapted to that kind of fire. So as far as habitat recovery, you may have this total type shift to plants that are more adapted to these really high severity wildfires.
It happens at the upper timberline as well, it's forming a pseudo subalpine forest, where the forests, as they were at timberline, severe forest fire knocks them back, and the timberline is kind of quasi for a long time.
Yeah, and yeah, there's a lot of research focused like trying to figure that out, but there's definitely, and in Alaska, there's also changes in their forest ecosystem. Yeah, go ahead.
I just was, I heard there was the most severe fire in Washington last summer, and I wondered what happened and what were the main casualties, like those landscape and, human and wildlife and
Breakdown like the fly habitat.
right. And how did it come about and how big was it?
Is this the one earlier this summer in Twisp and?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that fire actually, well, it was gigantic. I think it was 300,000 acres or more. So huge, the biggest fire ever recorded in Washington. It was not that severe. It certainly was severe in certain patches, but it occurred relatively early in the year, so the soil was still fairly wet, so there wasn't a lot of soil heating. It occurred in a lot of lower elevation habitat, so a lot of rangeland and lower elevation forest. And so not a lot of heavy timber, so the fire behavior was pretty low. And so as far as ecological impacts in terms of severity, it probably was, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing it was pretty low. But in terms of the area impacted, it was very large. So habitat recovery, a lot of those plants would probably be able to rebound fairly quickly within what they were used to doing. But the negative impacts for sure, aside from just the vast amount of area burned, was it burned down a couple of towns, which was awful, and it's obviously impacted a lot of people's lives, but ecologically I'm not so sure that it is as bad as some of these later season fires that were happening.
However, it has created a new political climate.
It what?
It's created a new political climate
How's
with
that?
regard to fires. People who, had their towns burned down now form a sufficient body of people who think maybe erroneously that, there should be some other things done.
Oh, of course, yeah. And that happens after every big fire,
Yeah.
is that there's more of a push to remove fires from the landscape completely, which is totally antithetical to what ecologists are trying to do. And anyone who has a sense of how managing fires to reduce fire hazard, to reduce the chance of these bigger fires, you need more and more prescribed fires on the landscape and to allow more and more natural fires to occur.
But this forest wasn't in areas which had a lot of suppression.
It was, yeah, but it wasn't. It didn't burn as intensely as it had fires have in some other places. And then I think the reason, what I've been told is the reason it was such a large fire is that it was a fairly wet spring, early spring, and there was a lot of vegetation growth, and that provided. And then that was followed in the mid to late spring by a lot of drying. So there was a lot of fine fuels available for it to burn. I don't know if that's actually what happened, but
Small settled variables that can make.
yeah, I mean, when you look at fires across the landscape, sometimes you can have really big fires that are not necessarily very severe, and sometimes you can have smaller fires that are really ecologically severe in that one spot. And this one, I haven't looked into it too much, so I don't know that much about it, but I don't think it was that bad in terms of severity. Yeah.
Is fire management sometimes sort of subject to what you might call politics of the sort, which is maybe an endangered species, like I assume it pops in the mind right off is maybe just northern spotted owl. It kind of rises to the top. There's a huge amount of just kind of TV coverage and political figures talking about it, for and against, whole forestry practices and all kinds of things that would focus on one species. And I might say, well, if we protect the northern spotted owl, we'll probably just kind of get in the top of a nice pyramid, and if we protect that one, you've protected a whole bunch of other stuff. But on the other hand, I can kind of picture there might be a really photogenic species that's endangered, and you as a fire manager would be subject to people saying you've got to protect that one.
Oh, so it's like
And
it's
here's
an
a whole
obstacle.
bunch of other stuff
Yeah.
that's not as photogenic, that TV people aren't gonna be there to
Yeah.
have a picture of it.
No, that
And
happens.
so
So
we just kind of get ground up by some other political almost.
Who's taking care of the banana slips?
the spotted owl is actually a good example. So the Northwest Forest Plan, there's habitat area, huge amounts of habitat that's been designated because of old growth characteristics. And a lot of that is on the east side of the Cascades, where it prevents any management actions from taking place. Well, a lot of these East Cascade forests are fire adapted, and they've had a long history of fire suppression, and the forests are very much departed from what they used to. There is greater undergrowth, there is a lot denser stands of timber, and so those forests are actually more predisposed to a large destructive wildfire that could destroy the northern spotted owl habitat. And really there are management actions that need to happen in order to reduce that chance and actually create a healthier forest just in terms of what it historically looked like and would support more species. So while the spotted owl, the Northwest Forest Plan works pretty well on the west side, on the east side, that elimination from management actions is actually probably a detriment to not only the spotted owl, but also the whole ecosystem. And I think people realize that and are trying to work to change that. So yeah, that's actually a pretty good example of that.
Thank you for an excellent program.
Yeah, thank you again for having me.